All right, thank you for joining us on this lovely evening. It's starting to feel like a warm spring out there. My name is Liz Reed, and I'm the head of the Adult Services Department at the Norwood Library, the Morrill Memorial Library. Tonight we have with us author Christopher Klein. He's the author of 4 books, the most recent of which is going to be the topic for tonight's talk. And tonight's talk is funded by the Friends of the Library. Now, Christopher Klein is a frequent contributor to History.com, which is the website for the History Channel. He's also written for the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Harvard Magazine, National Geographic Traveler. My gosh, I think there's even more websites you've written for. You've written for quite a few publications. So we're very pleased tonight to offer a little bit of a twist on the traditional Irish history program for March. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone for coming out virtually tonight. So I'm just going to pull my screen up here, so just bear with me for a second. So, as Liz mentioned, my writing is all in the history realm. So writing for the History Channel, the books I've written have been tied into history. And after I finished my last book, which was a biography of the Boston boxer John L. Sullivan, I was looking around for a story to write, and I came across this great idea. So I pitched it to my agent. I said, I've got a story. It's about a group of Irish immigrants who flee the Great Hunger, fight on both sides of the Civil War, and then they unite to undertake one of the most fantastical missions in military history, to hold Canada hostage and ransom it for Ireland's independence. And her question to me then right after that was, when did you decide to write fiction? So I had to assure her, and probably a lot of people when I tell this story, that although it sounds like complete blarney, this actually did happen, and that the Irish, there was an Irish army that invaded Canada not just once, but 5 times between 1866 and 1871 in what are known as the Fenian raids. So part of what I hope to do tonight is take everyone back about 150 years and to see that the idea isn't as crazy as it sounds today. So why would anyone want to attack sweet, peaceable, polite Canada, a place where, you know, if you get into an accident with the local city bus, it will tell you sorry? Well, part of it is we're viewing the lens of history through today. And when the United States and Canada shared the longest peaceable international boundary in the world. But things between the United States and Canada were not always so polite. And in the first American century, the United States had a border problem, but it was a northern one. The border between the United States and Canada was a lawless no man's land that was frequented by smugglers and counterfeiters. And the idea of invading Canada is about as American as fireworks on the 4th of July in the first 100 years of American history. So even before the Declaration of Independence is signed, the first place that the Continental Army goes is due north. And General Richard Montgomery will seize Montreal, and then he'll march on Quebec City and meet up with another unit of the Continental Army that was led by Colonel Benedict Arnold before he turned turncoat for the Redcoats. And they suffer a big defeat on New Year's Eve, 1775, right outside of Quebec City, and are forced to retreat. Then in the War of 1812, Canada again is the scene of a number of battles. And Thomas Jefferson, at the onset of the war, wrote that the taking of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. It would not. There were a number of defeats for American forces on Canadian soil. And even before the British are torching the White House and Washington, D.C., it's the Americans who are setting fire to the provincial capital of Ontario, which is a city called York, which today is Toronto. And the small village of Buffalo in its first years, that was also burned to the ground by British troops coming in from Canada as well. So a lot of activity going on along the border. Then after the War of 1812, you get a series of ridiculous interactions with equally farcical names, like the Pork and Beans War of 1838, which was a dispute between lumberjacks in New Brunswick and Maine, fighting over the same logging rights. My favorite is the Pig War of 1859, which took place out on San Juan Island in the Pacific Northwest, which was claimed as both territory for the United States and Canada. And one day, an American settler on the island saw a pig that was rooting around his potato garden, shot it dead. Turned out the pig was the property of the Hudson's Bay Company of Canada. And let's just say that things really spiraled out of control to the point that 500 American troops and 2,000 British forces and 5 warships are sent to this island in the Northwest. But luckily, no shots were fired. It was just a big standoff for months on end. And the biggest combat threat to the soldiers, it was said, who were out there was just the mind-numbing boredom of staring at each other for weeks and weeks and weeks. So the other thing to remember about this time period is that the flag that is flying over Canada at this time is not the maple leaf that we're all familiar with today, but it's the Union Jack. So if you were going to use today's parlance, you would say that the Irish who invaded Canada were radicalized by their experience living under British rule. And talk about the luck of the Irish a lot of times. Well, the luck of the Irish was not something you want to have for about 700 years of world history, because the Irish had the poor fortune of being in the backyard of what becomes the world's most powerful empire. And for many years and centuries, the British are trying to do away with Ireland's culture and its religion and its language and sort of recast them in their own image. And things were particularly bad if you were an Irish Catholic living in Ireland in the 1700s under what were called the penal law. So if you were an Irish Catholic, you could not hold public office, you could not send your child to a Catholic school to be taught, you could not freely worship, you could not own a horse that was worth more than 5 pounds, you couldn't own a firearm, you were allowed to have one knife in your house as long as it was chained down to a table so that you couldn't use it against the local police. And then even in death, your rights were restricted because Catholic priests were barred from presiding over any graveside ceremonies for any funerals. So you have this discrimination that is happening. And then in 1845, you have the potato blight and the failure of the potato crop. And so for 700 years, you have the British who are trying to take away Ireland's religion, its culture, and its language. And now there's a portion of the Irish who think that the British are trying to exterminate them altogether. And under the Great Hunger, which will take place between 1845 and 1853, you have 1 million Irish who die, another 2 million who are forced to flee into exile, and maybe about 1.5 million of them are going to cross the Atlantic and come to the United States and Canada. So when the potato blight starts in 1845, Ireland is an island that has more than 8 million people. 8 years later, population is down to around 5 million, and it still has not gone back to its pre-potato blight population number in the 150 years since then. So the Irish who come to America are unlike any newcomers that this country had seen before. In a very real sense, they're refugees, not immigrants. They aren't necessarily starving for American ideals as much as they are literally hungering for food. And a lot of them arrive poor, hungry, sick, and about a quarter of them speak the Irish language. They do not speak English. Many of them are illiterate. What really sets them apart in the eyes of many Americans in the 1840s and 1850s is that they are practicing a religion that is an alien religion to most Americans at the time, and that is Roman Catholicism. So you have a country that was built on a very sound Protestant foundation, and now you have tens of thousands of Irish Catholics pouring into the country. Boston itself is going to have 40, 50,000 Irish Catholics pouring into the city, increasing the population by over 50% of what it was before. So there's a backlash that starts to take place in America that really gains its strength in the 1850s. And you have what was called the rise of the Know Nothings, which was this nativist party. It was formerly called the American Party, but they were called the Know Nothings because it was a secret organization. And whenever they were asked about their doings and membership, supposedly they gave the parroted "I know nothing" response. And so that's how they were branded. And in 1854 is really the height of this backlash against the Irish. So you have, during the summer of 1854, you have a priest up in Maine who is tarred and feathered. You have churches that are set ablaze. There's a church in Dorchester that is gunpowder is set up to try to explode it. You have a very bizarre incident in 1854 when a group of know-nothings sneaks onto the construction site for the Washington Monument, and they tie up the night watchman, and they go searching for a particular block of marble. And when they find it, they wheel it down to the Potomac River. They throw it overboard where it plunges to the bottom of the Potomac. And the block that they're looking for is this block of marble that was donated by the Pope. And they think that this block of stone is going to be used as a signal to all the Catholics who are infiltrating America in their eyes to rise up, overthrow the American government, and then to establish a second Vatican in Cincinnati. Very unlikely place. So conspiracy theories running amok during this time. And the Know Nothings will actually, in that year's election, win 8 governorships, about 100 seats in the US Congress. They have their most success right here in Massachusetts, where they win every statewide office and all but 3 seats in the legislature. And then they start to implement their plan, which included launching secret inspections of Catholic rectories and nunneries. They were going to try to push naturalization to 21 years. No one could vote for until 21 years after they arrived in America. And they actually start deporting Irish back to the British Isles. So to say that the Irish didn't assimilate easily into America would be a vast understatement. And the English had long talked about the Irish problem. And of course, the problem with the Irish in the eyes of the English was that they weren't them. Winston Churchill has this quote that's supposedly attributed to him, that the English always found the Irish a bit odd because they refused to be English. And the way that they were able for 7 centuries to survive British occupation without losing their religion, their culture, and their language was they turned inward for protection, like a snake coiling itself. And that's what they're going to do when they arrive in the United States and face a similar type of discrimination. So they're going to cling together in Catholic church parishes, organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and then starting in 1858, they're going to start to join an organization called the Fenian Brotherhood. And the Fenian Brotherhood is the brainchild of these 2 men. On the left is James Stephens. On the right is a man named John O'Mahony. And these 2 men were both veterans of the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. This was a failed uprising in Ireland, another in the long line of failed uprisings against the British. And James Stephens, the man on the left here, has a really interesting story from this rebellion. So he's in a shootout and he is critically wounded and left for dead on the side of the road. He manages to survive this shootout, however, and is going to use this to his benefit. So he sort of pulls a page out of the Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer playbook and fakes his own death. So he has his friends run an obituary. His obituary runs in the local Kilkenny newspaper. His father will carry a coffin full of rocks and bury it in the local cemetery. And all the while, James Stephens is on the lam through the hills of Ireland, manages to escape to England dressed up as a woman. He will cross through England and is said to actually spend a night right across from Buckingham Palace under the nose of Queen Victoria until he flees to safety in Paris. And John O'Mahony, he will also flee Ireland and goes to Paris for safety. And the Great Hunger is going to end by 1853. And in the ensuing years, by 1858, both these men think that Ireland is ready for another uprising. So on St. Patrick's Day in 1858, James Stephens will form an organization called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Later that year in New York City, where John O'Mahony is now moved, which is now the second most Irish city in the world next to Dublin, he will start an organization called the Fenian Brotherhood. And the idea is that this is the first ever transatlantic revolutionary organization. So in Ireland, James Stephens is going to put together the manpower for another army that's going to try another revolution inside Ireland. And with the freedoms that America provides, John O'Mahony is going to buy weapons, raise money, and send it all to help finance and equip this army that James Stephens is putting together. So if you joined the Fenian Brotherhood in its early years, it was a secret oath-based organization. And it's because it was a secret organization that it actually runs afoul of the Catholic Church, because you were not allowed to be Catholic and take an oath in a secret organization. So after about 3 or 4 years, the Fenian Brotherhood drops the secret oaths and becomes an open organization, but it will never be in the good graces of the Catholic Church. So by 1871, almost a full decade after they're no longer a secret organization, the Pope will decree that any members of the Fenian Brotherhood will be excommunicated from the society. So you were taking some considerable risk in your spiritual life if you were a Catholic and you were joining the Fenian Brotherhood. So this plan is in place for having this revolution in Ireland, and then all of a sudden the Civil War breaks out. And there's a Civil War scholar lives in Ireland named Damien Shields, who's done some great research into the participation of native-born Irish in the American Civil War. And I was shocked when in doing the research to learn that, according to Damien Shields, about 200,000 native-born Irish fight in the Civil War, about 180,000 for the Union, about 20,000 for the Confederacy. And the side that the Irish fought on really was just a matter of geography, where they happened to land when they came to America. The Irish who were signing up to fight for the Union cause, they really weren't doing it to free the slaves. Maybe some of them were trying to prove their patriotism and preserve the Union. For many of them, it really was just a way for them to earn a paycheck. They're at the bottom of the economic ladder. A lot of them are unemployed. They don't think the war is going to last too long. So they'll sign up for 3 months. They might die doing the job, but it's a job, and it's one that's going to pay money to them. So that's why they join in such numbers. For some Fenians, however, they think that the Civil War is a great opportunity. This is a way for them to learn battlefield tactics and learn about weaponry that they're going to use then and take to fight the real war that they want to wage, and that's going to be the revolution in Ireland. Now, of course, the war is going to drag on for a lot longer than anyone thought. The Irish are the ones in particular who are going to pay for it in terrible numbers. I think maybe an estimated 35,000 Irish are going to die in the Civil War. And as the war progresses, the Fenian Brotherhood will actually start recruiting inside Union Army camps. So local Fenian organizations were called circles, and there were Fenian circles that were established with the Army of the Potomac, Tennessee, and Cumberland. There were Fenian circles that were established on Navy ships as well. And by 1863, when the Fenians start having their own national convention, certain Fenians were allowed to get passes to leave the front lines, to leave the battlefields and go to Chicago and attend the convention. And by the end of the Civil War, the Fenian Brotherhood has a good tens of thousands of members, but they really gain their strength in the months after the end of the Civil War. So there are recruiters who start going to the mill cities of New England. So they'll go to Lawrence one night, Lowell the next night, then on to Holyoke, and they'll stage great evenings of Irish entertainment, and people would pay money to go, and that money would be used to support the Fenian Brotherhood and to finance the revolution in Ireland. They will go to the mining towns in Appalachia, around Scranton and Hazleton in Pennsylvania. And so by early 1866, the Fenian Brotherhood is a pretty big organization, has its own president, has its own constitution, and it has its own Capitol building right in the heart of New York City on the north side of Union Square. It's this 4-story brownstone called the Moffett Mansion. You can see at the top, they're flying both the Stars and Stripes, and that would be a green flag with a golden harp on it, a symbol of Ireland. And so this is where the Irish Republican exile, is what they called themselves, had its capital. Again, everything happening completely out in the open here, but still banned by the Catholic Church, supposedly for being a secret organization. And the Fenian Brotherhood would sell war bonds. This is how it was going to finance the revolution in Ireland. So they sold war bonds in denominations between $10 and $500. These war bonds would be payable 6 months after the establishment of the Irish Republic. So there's an interesting side note to these bonds. When the Irish Republic is eventually created, decades and decades later, all of a sudden these war bonds come out of people's drawers in the United States, and they go looking to get them collected from the government in Dublin, who has no idea what these bonds are. They never issued them, and they certainly weren't about to pay them off. But if you go onto eBay nowadays, you can see that these war bonds are catching a pretty penny, so they might still be a good investment if anyone still got them in their drawers. So the plan's in place. Fall of 1865 to have the revolution in Ireland, but the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland has been infiltrated by British spies. And this is the one irony of the Fenians being cast aside by the Catholic Church for being a secret organization, because the one thing that they could not do throughout their entire history is to keep a secret. So they're infiltrated by British spies. They know that there's this planned uprising in Ireland, and they crack down on the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They arrest their leaders. James Stephens is forced into hiding again. And the idea of having a revolution in Ireland is dead in the water. And this is happening at the same time that there's starting to be a growing movement among the Fenian Brotherhood in America, who thinks the whole idea of having a revolution in Ireland is the crazy idea anyway, because they've tried it many times over the centuries. It has never worked. They're buying up all these weapons after the end of the Civil War because the United States government is putting them up for auction. So they're buying plenty of weapons, but they have no way of getting it to Ireland. They don't even have a single ship, let alone a navy. So they think this whole idea of having this transatlantic revolution is just a silly one. They think the much smarter idea is to hit the British Empire right in their backyard, and that's going to be Canada. So in New England, they can get on a train in the Boston area, be up at the Canadian border the next morning, and there they can walk right in and invade the British Empire that way. So that, after this crackdown in Ireland, is going to be the plan for the Fenian Brotherhood. So now their numbers are going to split apart. So, I mean, this is just part of the Fenian Brotherhood who wants to carry out this attack on Canada, but they are going to be the bigger half of the Fenian Brotherhood that's going to carry this out. So what are they trying to do with attacking Canada? What can they hope to expect? Well, they have one idea that maybe what they are going to do is divert British troops from protecting Ireland to Canada, and that will leave Ireland more susceptible for a possible revolution to occur there. Another idea is that they can just go over, get a little piece of territory from Canada, and then they will be given belligerent rights to launch privateers out on the oceans and disrupt British shipping. Probably their best idea here, their most realistic, is that they can spark a war between the United States and Great Britain. And by helping the United States conquer Canada and take possession of it, in return, the United States will pressure Great Britain to give Ireland its independence. And then there's this hardcore group of Fenians who are thinking very much like Thomas Jefferson was, and they think that the taking of Canada is going to be a mere matter of marching. They'll go in, they'll take over Canada, and they will literally ransom it for Ireland's independence from the British. Now, the thing that I found most surprising in doing the research for this book is that this idea actually has the tacit support of the American government. So not only is the United States selling the Fenians weapons after the end of the Civil War, and any of the men who fought in the Civil War could purchase their own weapons that they had carried into battle as well. There's a meeting that occurs in the White House in the fall of 1865 between a group of Fenians and President Andrew Johnson. And according to the account that we have from the Fenians, and we have to take into account that this is the only report that we have of this meeting, so we have to just keep that in mind. They sort of float their idea to Johnson of invading Canada just to get his impression of what he might do. And according to the Fenians, Johnson tells them that he will, quote, acknowledge accomplished facts. More or less, he's not going to stand in their way, but he's not going to do anything to actively help them either. So if he wakes up one day and the Fenians are in Canada, then he'll deal with it at that point. So they take that to mean that it's pretty much a green light for them to move ahead with this plan of attacking Canada. So why is Andrew Johnson taking that position when attacking a country with the United States is at peace is a violation of American neutrality laws? Well, it goes to speak to the tremendous animosity that is existing in the United States towards Great Britain at the end of the Civil War. So you might remember from your history books as a kid that Great Britain declares itself neutral during the war, which is sort of a tacit support for the Confederacy. There was that incident called the Trent Affair very early on in the war, where a pair of Confederate diplomats were taken off a British mail steamer by the United States government that almost led to war with Great Britain very early on. But what really rankles Americans is the fact that it was in British ports that Confederate warships were being constructed and privateers were being built. And it was said that some of these ships were crewed not just by men from the South, but also from British soldiers who were also faking Southern accents while they were on these privateers as well. And the most fearsome of them is this ship here. It's the Css Alabama. It will disrupt Union shipping all across the world for, I think, a good year and a half or so. It's estimated it caused about $5 million in damage to Union shipping. And at the end of the war, Andrew Johnson wants reparations. He wants Great Britain to pay about $10 million for all the damage that was caused by the Confederate ships that were being built in British ports. And there's a lot of anger towards Canada itself over what happened during the Civil War. So Canada's a haven for Union draft dodgers, for Confederate prisoners of war, but it's also a sanctuary for a cell of the Confederate Secret Service. And this cell is blamed for the raids on the banks in St. Albans, Vermont in 1864, when a group of Confederate raiders stormed across the border and took about $150,000 that they robbed from the banks in St. Albans, Vermont. Later that year, they tried to firebomb theaters and hotels and other public spaces in New York City that they tried to carry out, but luckily the bombs that they built just didn't ignite properly. And there's a thought that they were also involved in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because there's eyewitness reports that John Wilkes Booth was walking around the streets of Montreal in the days before the assassination. After he was killed, reportedly, there was a note from the Royal Ontario Bank that was found in one of his coat pockets. And one of the conspirators managed to escape out of Washington, D.C. after the assassination, crossed into Canada. He was given sanctuary by a priest in Quebec before he actually escaped to England, before he was eventually captured there. And then at the same time, with all this animosity towards Great Britain and Canada, America still has this manifest destiny ethos. So the country has acquired territory from Mexico. It is expanded now from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The South is reunited. So where's the next place the United States is going to go to do what most Americans thought was to be naturally expanding, and that's going to be due north to Canada. So there's actually a bill that's introduced into Congress in 1865 that already is planning out where the 4 new states are going to come from the territory in Canada that they're going to acquire. It apportions out 22 seats in Congress for those 4 states. And then I found that after the Civil War, there was a proposal by a senator named Zach Chandler. And Chandler has this idea as a way to bring the country back together after the Civil War, that the United States should put together a 200,000 man army with 100,000 men from the North and 100,000 men from the South. And according to his plan, which had 30 backers in the Senate, this army is going to invade Canada, and it's going to occupy and take over Canada, and it's going to stay there until the British pay their reparations. So in essence, they're going to hold Canada hostage and ransom it for the Alabama claims. So into Andrew Johnson's office come the Fenians with pretty much the same plan. So why not take this job that native-born Americans were going to do and give it to the Irish immigrants to do? That's basically the thought process here. So the war plan, the idea of invading Canada, it's the brainchild of this man, Thomas William Sweeney, who to me really is the epitome of the fighting Irish. So he is born in Ireland. At the age of 11, he immigrates to the United States, but on his voyage to America, he's swept overboard into the cold Atlantic. He manages to survive 30 minutes in the water before he is finally rescued. He will join the Union Army, fight in the Mexican-American War. He is in a heated battle, takes a gunshot to his groin, keeps on fighting, and minutes later, another bullet will pierce his right arm and force it to be amputated. Sweeney, however, keeps fighting in the army. He actually gets into a fist fight with his commanding officer and whips him with his one remaining arm. And during the Civil War, he is very instrumental at the Battle of Shiloh, in spite of taking 2 gunshots to his remaining arm and 1 more to his leg. But what's really remarkable to me about Sweeney is that after all this, after giving about 20 years of his life to the Union Army, sacrificing his right arm to the United States government, he still sees himself as an Irishman first and an American second. So he leaves the Union Army to become Secretary of War with the Fenian Brotherhood, and he will come up with this war plan to invade Canada. And it's a 5-pronged invasion starting in the West. So boats will be launched from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo. Those armies that cross over will converge on Toronto. What Sweeney is hoping is that this is going to divert Canadian Defense Forces and British troops from what his real target is, and that is Montreal and Quebec. So he wants to get these defense forces moving towards Toronto out of the way for a 17,000 man army that he is going to send straight up through the Lake Champlain Valley, cross over into Quebec, seize Montreal, then Quebec City. And then at that point, the Irish will have a chokehold on the St. Lawrence River, which is the lifeblood of Canadian commerce. And then it will have basically Canada in its hand at that point. Baked into Sweeney's plan is very much like Jefferson thought, that taking Canada is going to be the mere matter of marching. He assumes that once he crosses into Canada, that tens of thousands of Irish in America are going to board trains to come along behind his army, join in this fight. He expects the tens of thousands of Irish who had settled and stayed in Canada are going to join with his forces. And he thinks that he's going to get the support of all the French speakers in Quebec as well, who he think are going to want to cast off British rule as much as the Irish in Ireland want to do. So that is very much a part of Sweeney's plans. So this is a plan that sounds great to this man here, and his name is John O'Neill. He's really at the center of all these Fenian raids. He's going to be the central character when the Irish invaded Canada. And John O'Neill did not join the Fenian Brotherhood until he heard this idea of attacking Canada, which he thought was a brilliant idea. So he's living in Nashville at the time. John O'Neill was a Civil War veteran, born in Ireland. He saw firsthand how the Great Hunger ravaged his town, which lost a quarter of its population. He learned as a very young boy of great tales that his grandfather told him about members of the O'Neill clan, men like Hugh O'Neill and Owen Roe O'Neill, who were famous in Irish lore because they stood up to the British and dared to fight them. They didn't free Ireland. The odds were against them, but they chose to fight. And even the Irish who chose to fight, even though they didn't succeed, really became part of Irish folklore. And O'Neill knows that. So he's very willing to fight for the cause of Ireland, to the point that when he gets the telegram to head to the war front from General Sweeney, he will kiss goodbye to his newlywed wife, his 6-month-old son, and he will leave behind a business that's doing very well for himself. He's willing to risk all of it, and he knows that the odds against him are long, but the odds against the Irish were always long. So he goes off to join in this invasion of Canada. So his goal is he's going to be part of this invasion from Cleveland. So when O'Neill actually gets to Cleveland, he's finding out what Sweety's finding out at the same time, and that the plan is starting to fall apart even before it can begin. The boats cannot be found in Chicago. The commanding officer does not arrive in Cleveland. To make matters worse, the secret invasion is not so secret. Again, the Fenians have not been very good at keeping this plan to themselves. They have been infiltrated by American spies and Canadian spies and British spies. Newspapers are reporting that they've got Irish who are boarding with their weapons in Nashville and New Orleans and Louisville, and they're all heading north. So it's all in the newspapers. So Sweeney basically has to call an audible on his war plan here. And he decides what he's going to do is just get as many men as possible to Buffalo. And if he figures that once he can just get men onto Canadian soil again, they'll be fine, because then there's going to be all these Irish who are going to join in behind them from America, and all the ones in Canada are going to help them. So his main goal is just, let's get the invasion going, let's get onto Canadian soil, and it'll be fine. So John O'Neill finds himself being the right man in the right place at the right time, because he's the highest ranking member of the army that can be found, of the 800 men who are in Buffalo. So O'Neill's put in charge of this army, and to him, this is the fulfillment of his life. This is what he was born to do. So he actually wrote that the governing passion of my life, apart from my duty to my God, is to be at the head of an Irish army battling against England for Ireland's rights. For this I live, and for this, if necessary, I am willing to die. So on the night of May 31st, 1866, the Fenian army starts coming out of the woodwork of the First Ward neighborhood of Buffalo, which was where the Irish immigrants had settled. And there's about 800 men who are marching through the streets of Buffalo to get to the Niagara River, the point to launch their barges across the river. So there's only one thing that is standing between this Irish army and Canadian soil, and that is the USS Michigan. There's one warship that is in an American port. So even though that there's these reports of the Irish army being invaded, there are no Canadian Defense Forces that are waiting on the other side of the river. And that is because the Canadian government, British forces, thought the attack was coming on St. Patrick's Day. So they canceled all the parades in Toronto, Montreal, all their cities. They sent 10,000 volunteers to guard the border, and then nothing happened. So now it's sort of like the boy who cried wolf, and they're afraid to call out their volunteers and go through all this expense again if all these rumors that are being printed in the papers do not come true. So there's no Canadian Defense Forces, no boats that are patrolling the river. There's just this one American warship that's in the port. And so when Captain Andrew Bryson, who is in charge of USS Michigan, gets reports that the Irish army is marching through Buffalo, he sends his order to his pilot to get the boat out into the river. Now, unbeknownst to Captain Bryson, he doesn't know that there's a Fenian sleeper cell among the crew on the boat. So there are 17 crew members who are members of the Fenian Brotherhood. And they know that this boat is not going anywhere without its pilot. And the pilot of the boat, his name is Patrick Murphy. But do not let the name fool you. Patrick Murphy is a loyal sailor. He was a member of the British Navy. He was a member of the American Navy. He's going to take whatever order he's given, and the Fenians on board know that. So they know that they have to sabotage this boat, and the only way that they can do that is they need to take Patrick Murphy out. And I don't mean that they need to kill him. Their plan is they take Patrick Murphy on the night of May 31st, 1866, out on the town to the waterfront dives in Buffalo. So when Captain Bryson is looking around for Patrick Murphy is stumbling down Main Street in Buffalo, supposedly arm in arm with a lady of the night singing The Wearing of the Green. And the USS Michigan is not leaving port. That night, the coast is clear, and John O'Neill and his 800 men sail across the Niagara River, plant their Irish flag right into British soil, and they begin their occupation of Canada. And it's going to be a full 24 hours before they meet any of these Canadian Defense Forces who are finally getting the reports that actually the Canadians have invaded this time. It's a real invasion, and they are working to finally repel it. So the first engagement is going to happen on the morning of June 2nd outside the village of Ridgeway, which is about 20 miles south of Niagara Falls, maybe about 15 miles west of Buffalo. And John O'Neill is got a position on top of a limestone ridge, and then he can see the Canadian Defense Forces coming his way, and he can see that he's outnumbered by about 3-1. So although he's outnumbered, John O'Neill has an advantage because he has a much more experienced force. So when he looks around his men, he sees he's got men who are actually dressed in their Union Army blues and Confederate grays. A lot of them are carrying the weapons that they fought with in the Civil War. They're battle-hardy, hardened men. Some of them have come as far as New Orleans. They were members of the Louisiana Tigers. So they've been in battle. They know what to expect. The Canadian Defense Forces, not so much. You have some farmers who've never fired a gun in their lives. You have a regiment that is made up entirely of students from the University of Toronto. They got a knock on the door the night before the battle saying, good news, you don't have to study for your finals anymore. Bad news is you need to be in Toronto at downtown Toronto at the drill shed at 3 a.m. where you're going to be given a gun and sent off to the battlefield to repel the Southern invasion. So the two forces collide on the morning of June 2nd, 1866. And this is the most common depiction that we have of what the battle looked like. And I can assure you that it looked nothing like this. So for one thing, the two forces were not fighting in these close quarters like you would see if you're going to the reenactment of the battles of Lexington and Concord. They're not fighting in open field. They're actually fighting among split rail fences and trees in an orchard. And let's talk about what they're wearing here too. So the British Canadian Defense Forces, they were not wearing red. They were not dressed up as the redcoats. And the Irish Army was certainly not dressed up in all greens. They, as I said, had a mixture of Union blues and Confederate grays, civilian clothes. They're carrying this flag here. This depiction says IRA. Now, they will become known as the Irish Republican Army. And when they launched an invasion in 1870, they will have battle flags that say IRA. They will be wearing green uniforms that have buttons on them that say IRA. But that's not the case here in Ridgeway in 1866. So I'll show you now a watercolor that's done by an eyewitness to the battle. And you can see men wearing green uniforms here. They weren't the Irish. These are the Canadian Defense Forces. And you can see that it's not an open field. They're not fighting in close quarters here. It's a very chaotic scene. So the Canadians with their superior numbers get the better of the fight initially. So John O'Neill does what he can only do with an experienced force, and that he pulls his men back. And the Canadians start getting a little bit full of themselves, thinking they're getting the better of the fight, and start to outrun their lines. And then all of a sudden, John O'Neill at the right moment comes charging on top of the limestone ridge on top of his horse and gives the order for his men to charge. And all of a sudden, the tide of the battle changes. And the inexperienced Canadian Defense Forces go into a textbook formation to repel a cavalry charge because they see John O'Neill on a horse. So they're expecting a lot more horses to follow, but they don't. And they're basically left as sitting ducks against the charging infantry of the Fenian army. And within minutes, the Canadians are going to start running for their lives, throwing their weapons down. And John O'Neill is going to emerge victorious at the Battle of Ridgeway. He will forever be known as the hero of Ridgeway. This is the crowning achievement that the Fenians have. It is a deadly battle. There are about 20 men who were killed. There are prisoners taken on both sides. But at the end of it, John O'Neill is wondering, where are all the reinforcements? Where are those tens of thousands of Fenians who are supposed to be pouring in from across the American border, and all the Canadians who are going to be rising up to help us? So he circles back to near his landing spot at Fort Erie. There's another running battle through the streets of the town. Again, the Fenians will emerge victorious. But when John O'Neill gets to the waterfront, he sees what has happened, and that is that the USS Michigan and other American warships have basically cut off his supply line. So Fenians think they've been double-crossed by Andrew Johnson because now the American government has intervened. And there are, for days on end, there are hundreds and hundreds of Irishmen who pour into Buffalo who are looking to join this attack, but the American government is not going to let them pass. So John O'Neill knows that he can only do one thing, and that is to retreat back to American soil. So when they are retreating back, Captain Bryson is going to arrest the entire Fenian army. And you see here on this lithograph that they are tied to the back of the Michigan here on this open deck, where they are kept for a good 2 days, exposed to all elements while they await word from the dithering Andrew Johnson on what to do with these prisoners. And after 48 hours of leaving these men just out there, exposed to all elements, Johnson decides he will let them go. The United States government will pay for their rail fare back to their homes, back to where they came from. John O'Neill and his fellow commanders, however, they're going to get arrested. They're going to be tried in a courtroom in Buffalo. They're released on bail with the aid of a local Buffalo lawyer by the name of Grover Cleveland, who, of course, will become the president of the United States. Now, before he leaves British territory, John O'Neill lines up all the Canadian prisoners that the Fenians have taken. And they are fully expecting that they are about ready to face a firing squad. Instead, John O'Neill goes down the line, shakes each man's hand one by one, tells them that they are going to be free, but he warns them that he's coming back. And he's going to be coming back with a much larger army the next time. And John O'Neill is going to be true to his word because he's going to attack Canada again in 1870 and again in 1871. So with all that, I've taken you only about 100 pages into when the Irish invaded Canada. There's still a good 200 plus pages still to go in this amazing story. But I will give you this one spoiler alert. The idea that the Fenians had of holding Canada hostage and ransoming it for Ireland's independence did not work. So what is their lasting legacy? Well, I see that there's three things here. One is that they bring self-government to one part of the British Empire, just not the one that they intended. So in the wake of the Battle of Ridgeway, which saw Canadians die and this invasion happening without any defense forces stationed at the border, it gives a large impetus to a growing movement inside Canada for self-government. It's called the Confederation Movement. So after these Fenian raids, there's a lot of support for Canada to take care of its own defense, to have its own parliament. So on July 1st, 1867, barely a year after this Battle of Ridgeway, the first Canadian Parliament sits in Ottawa. And Ottawa at the time is this backwater lumber town. But it's chosen to be the capital because it can't be close to the American border because there have been so many invasions over the last century. So Toronto's bypassed, Montreal is bypassed, Ottawa is what turns out to be the choice here. The second legacy is that this transatlantic organization that the Irish have in place here, however, will be successful in a few decades with the Easter Rising in 1916. So when the Irish Proclamation is read outside the General Post Office in the Easter Rising, very prominent mention is given to Ireland's exiled children in America because the weapons and money that is raised here was instrumental in the Easter Rising and eventually Ireland's war for independence. And even to the present, more modern history with Northern Ireland, you have money being collected for the IRA in cities around the country like Boston and weapons being smuggled to them. And that Irish Republican Brotherhood that James Stephens founds in 1858 in Dublin is the same organization that is the Irish Republican Army that is in modern history with Northern Ireland as well. So it's this direct through line. I think the third legacy, though, is that what the Fenians did is they took the torch of revolution from that young Ireland generation, they handed it off to the Easter Rising generation. And they knew the odds were against them, but they were willing to fight. And I think that's sort of the message here is that it's a lesson that you may not necessarily see the fruits of your labor for any fights that you have in your lifetime, be it maybe a fight against cancer, a fight for civil rights, but that doesn't mean that you don't put up the fight because it might be that future generations and your ancestors may benefit from the fight that you put up there today. So with that, I guess we take questions in a few minutes. before we do so too, just if you want more information on the book or any of the writing that I do for the History Channel and other sources, if you go to my website, christopherklein.com, there's a button up in the upper left-hand corner too that you can sign up for my free monthly e-newsletter where I talk about a lot of history stories that might be tied into what's going on in the news, any interesting history programs or books I may be reading as well. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that too. So I guess with that, Liz, maybe we can see if anyone's got any questions.
Absolutely. And actually, the first one out of the gate, and feel free, folks, to chat the question. If you want to ask it yourself, perfectly fine. Probably when I stop recording, I'll let people turn off their mics. But chat your questions in the meanwhile. And the first question is actually from somebody who was already a fan and a reader before tonight's program. He has your book. He's read it and said he drove all the way from Gettysburg to Ridgeway and actually walked the battlefield.
Wow.
And thinks that's very fascinating. So the question, though, is do you think the Fenians could have been successful? Do you think they could have been victorious if the U.S. had not intervened? Because they did have a successful battle at Ridgeway. So how do you think they would have done against the regulars?
I still think they probably had their hands full there. One thing that the Fenians weren't too great at was doing reconnaissance, and there was a lot of assumptions that were built in here too, that they were going to get the support of Irish Canadians and the French and speakers, which really wasn't there. So they were going to have a very hard time continuing on. Plus, once the Canadian Defense Forces and British regulars got organized, they were going to have a very difficult time doing that. So I think their only real chance of any sort of success was going to be to spark something that's going to get the United States Army involved here. Because again, the United States sort of has its eyes up towards Canada. Maybe there's something that they can do that, you have these many that are Irish immigrants are American citizens. So maybe there's some diplomatic incident that they can cause here that's going to cause the United States to come in behind them. I think that's probably their most realistic option here. I don't think even if the Americans cut their supply lines, even though there are these hundreds and thousands of Irish who are going to come behind them, they weren't necessarily all carrying weapons. This is an army that didn't have a commissary. They're living off the land. So I think they really would have had their hands cut out for them. They really needed to have this American backing to, I think, have the kind of success that they wanted to have if they were going to take significant chunks of Canadian territory here.
Well, I'll stick with Ridgeway for a quick second. Why do you think that when, the cat got out of the bag and it wasn't such a secret anymore that the invasion was going to happen, why do you think they picked Buffalo as the crossing point? The map you showed was a 5-pronged attack. Why do you think Buffalo was the point of contact?
So Buffalo was pretty central to a lot of where a lot of Fenian members were. Western New York had a lot of Fenian members. Rochester, Buffalo were pretty big hotbeds for Fenian activity, and the Fenians had their own regiment in Buffalo. They had someone in there who was involved in an auction house, and he was able to use that as a cover to smuggle a lot of weapons into his auction house there. So it was a great staging point for them. They were able to, a lot of these cities along the border, that's what they were looking to do, is to basically smuggle the weapons in, we'll get the men up there, then they'll carry their weapons into battle. So they had a large store of weapons already there in Buffalo. They were get the biggest group there. So it was pretty natural then, let's send those men who are amassing in Cleveland, they can just stay on the train and be there overnight to go into Buffalo, and then we'll launch the attack from there. And it's not nearly as big a problem as trying to launch at a boat, across Lake Erie or Lake Michigan. You're standing on the shoreline, you're looking right over at Canadian territory and cross there pretty easily overnight.
Now, you mentioned when the decision was made that, okay, this is the action the Fenians are going to take, they're going to invade Canada, that actually split the Fenian Brotherhood, that only part of the faction really wanted to invade. Do we know what happened to the other faction? Did they kind of hold down the fort in America, or did they actually try to stage a different kind of invasion?
So John O'Mahony, who was the founder of the Fenian Brotherhood, was always of the mindset of having the revolution in Ireland as was originally planned. So when the organization splits apart in 1866, he starts being on the minority side here inside the Fenian Brotherhood. He's the one that's bleeding membership. So he's actually still in that Capitol building I showed you, the Moffett Mansion in New York. And literally maybe 2 blocks around the corner is where the group that wants to do Canadian invasion starts setting up their headquarters. But money's starting to pour into their headquarters, and the Moffett Mansion, they're just becoming a bit of a ghost town in there. And so they're trying to figure out any way to make their part of the organization survive. And as crazy as it sounds, they decided basically what we're going to maybe try to do is beat the other group to the punch, and we'll try to seize just a little bit of Canadian territory. So they launched this attempted invasion of Campobello Island, which many of you probably know of from the connection with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt right over the Maine border in New Brunswick. So Amani reluctantly gives the approval that let's just try to seize just Campobello Island and only Campobello Island, and we'll use that as our launching point then to have our republic in exile, but we're still going to go to Ireland. That's still our plan. And it's a complete and utter disaster. So he sort of gets cold feet after sending the guns up, and the guns never arrive in Maine, but the men do. So the men end up spending just a couple hundred of them are just loitering around Eastport, Maine for a good couple weeks. Until finally the United States government dispatches General George Meade up there to get his old men to come back from the border. And they claim that they're just there on a fishing expedition, even though they were trying to get these guns. And they come back to New York City, and all they have to show for it is they burn down one structure on Canadian territory, which happened to be owned by an American, and they take down a Union Jack off a custom house. And at this point, they are just utterly disgraced, and John O'Mahony has to resign from the organization that he founded, and they pretty much they're going to recede into the background at this point. And it's John O'Neill's section of the Fenian Brotherhood that's going to be in the ascendancy for the next 5-6 years afterwards.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. I'll just read it as it's written. I understand Britain threatened war against the U.S. if the U.S. did not intervene. Was Britain actually in a position at that time to back up that threat of punishing the United States if they didn't intervene? Do you think the U.S. was vulnerable since the Civil War had just ended?
Yeah, so I guess I hadn't come across anything that said that Britain was really itching for a fight here. They were sort of, from what I had seen, they are not eager to have a fight here over Canada. They don't necessarily like their odds. And even though the United States had been weakened as a result of the Civil War, I mean, you have this huge advantage of geography, and you have these battle-hardened men that are ready to go to battle. And in fact, after the Battle of Ridgeway, there are a couple dozen Fenians who are going to be court-martialed in Toronto and Montreal. They're going to be convicted of treason against the government, and they're going to be put on death row. And it's a big diplomatic row because the Canadians, they want some justice to what they think has just happened to them. They've had a dozen of their men die. There's several of them were students at the University of Toronto. So they've seen boys of theirs die, and they want some justice for it. But it's the British government who pressures the Canadians to let these men go because they don't want to spark anything greater between Canada, the United States, and Great Britain at this time. So they're looking to try to cool the situation here in the aftermath of the Battle of Ridgeway. So it's this interesting diplomatic dynamic that's going on with these three different, Canada not necessarily being its own country till 1967, but between Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. And the Fenians really are the pawns that they're all moving here for their different purposes that they're looking to do in these years after the Civil War.
And O'Neill, was he imprisoned in Canada or the United States?
So O'Neill is going to actually not be convicted in American court. So after the battle, he comes back to the United States. He is released on bail, and it's basically decided months later that they're not going to actively prosecute the leaders of the Fenian invasion. In fact, there's an interesting incident that happens a couple of months after the Battle of Ridgeway. O'Neill returns to Buffalo, and the Fenians stage their own now reenactments of the Battle of Ridgeway on the Buffalo side, in gunshot, you can hear the fake gunshots going off as they're staging their reenactments of this great moment there. Kind of taunting the Canadian side. O'Neill will, in 1870, try another invasion from just north of St. Albans, Vermont, into Quebec. And John O'Neill, rather ignominiously, is going to be arrested by the United States government on the battlefield itself on American territory. So he's arrested, stands trial, and he is convicted, and he's put into a prison in Vermont until Ulysses S. Grant, who's president at the time, decides that he will pardon John O'Neill if John O'Neill promises never to invade Canada again. Now, John O'Neill may have believed it when he told him that he would never invade Canada again, but within about a year, inside of a year, he's attempting another invasion of Canada again.
And I'm curious, I'm sure that it's explained in the book, where does the name Fenian Brotherhood come from?
So John O'Mahony was a Gaelic scholar and was really liked stories from Irish mythology. And one of those stories was about these Gaelic warriors, these legendary Gaelic warriors that were called the Fianna. So he makes up pretty much coins the term Fenian out of the name for these legendary Gaelic warriors to brand for his organization. So that's really where the term comes from, and it's going to survive long after the demise of the Fenian Brotherhood. So, it becomes used interchangeably with a word for an Irish nationalist. Sometimes it's used pejoratively these days in the British Isles. But it stays with us. But John O'Mahony is really the one who creates it, and it's because of his knowledge of the Irish language and Irish scholar. He translated a lot of these legends when he was before he took up the leadership of the Fenian Brotherhood.
And has it been recorded anywhere what the response of the Irish in Ireland was at the time of the Fenian invasions of Canada?
So the interesting thing really is here that the Irish in America in some ways seem to be more revolutionary than the Irish who remained in Ireland after the Great Hunger. I mean, a lot of people are just trying to get on with their lives and survive, and they've moved on. I mean, not to say that there certainly isn't a revolutionary spirit in Ireland, because in the midst of this whole story, there are Americans who are going to try to carry out that original plan of a revolution in Ireland. So there's an it's called the Fenian Rising in 1867. So those people who were followers of John O'Mahony, they are some, a few hundred are going to go to Ireland. There's another attempted uprising, which fails just utterly. It lasts all of about 24 hours and nothing happens. So not to say that there's not a revolutionary spirit in Ireland, but in some ways, the Irish who come to America, they are longing for their homeland, they're living in exile, and have some more of that revolutionary fervor, whereas the Irish in Ireland figure that you're trying to have this attempted uprising against British rule, and then you're going to go back to safety in the United States, whereas we're still under the British rule here, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences. So there's not as much support in Ireland as you may think for what's going on here in the United States. I think they just want to handle whatever revolution they're going to do there, but they are really kind of fearful of getting any consequences of what these people are doing over in Canada, and then being able to go back to the United States and not face the consequences that they may have to face in living under British rule.
Now, sorry, you may have mentioned it and I missed it, but I was just busy picking my jaw up off the floor. Do we know how much money they raised with the war bonds? I had no idea.
I'd have to dig it out of the book, but they raised a lot of money. So they would have probably I think it was like March of 1866, so a couple months before this invasion, they're having a rally in New York City that's getting like 60,000 people to it. I mean, they are filling big spaces, and there's a lot of support for what they're trying to do. And they're selling these war bonds at these rallies, and whenever they're doing their nights of Irish culture and entertainment as they go around, that they'll play Irish music and recite Irish poetry. And at the end of the night, the Fenian recruiter will go up there and make his plea for people to join the organization, but they're taking money at the door. You have women who are doing bake sales, raising money for it as well. So, they are raising enough money to lease their own, their own Capitol building and purchase these weapons. So they're getting a good amount of cash. Now they're starting to lose it as they split apart into their different into their different little fiefdoms here. But they really have a considerable amount of power and money in 1866.
And again, I'm a librarian, and I know we have some people in the audience who are big fans of this topic. What would you recommend as sort of some of the best sources to go looking for more information about this topic?
So what's kind of interesting is that a lot of the books that have been written about the Fenian raids themselves have been written from the Canadian perspective. So, I mean, that's interesting to us here in America, to get that side of the story too, because I mean, this is sort of a seminal moment in Canadian history. It's sort of maybe a little bit akin to when we look back at the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre as sort of one of the stepping stones. So there's a number of books that have been published by Canadian authors. There's a book that was called Ridgeway. That's a very detailed history about what happened at the Battle of Ridgeway as well. I think it's really interesting if anyone has access to just like newspaper subscriptions from the day, just to go back to that time period and just read what's in the newspapers at that day. You really get a sense for what is going on in the American culture at the time and that moment in history. So that's out there as well. But maybe what's most interesting and what I relied on pretty heavily is that at Villanova University has a lot of letters and documents from the Fenian Brotherhood that have been digitized. So if you go to, I think if you just do a search probably for like Villanova University and Fenian Brotherhood, it'll take you to where you can see some handwritten letters, a lot of the circulars and information that the Fenian Brotherhood was sending out. The Catholic University of America also has a lot of letters from Fenian leaders in there as well. So if you're looking for primary sources, those are two interesting repositories you can check out, and you can access the information that they have online too, which is particularly great when we have limited access to archives, even if we wanted to try to go to them in person these days. So.
Oh, that is wonderful. That's really great information. Folks, I'm going to wrap up the official recording for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Chris